While inflation remains high, though, I need to highlight that our economy is doing incredibly well. It's growing. In December, over 41,000 new full-time jobs were created in our province, and that really is something to celebrate. There are still 100,000 job openings in our province, so Alberta is still calling, which means that there is work for those who are looking. And that work is an ever-increasing number of industries and sectors as our province continues to diversify its economy. This is why I'm also concerned about Justin Trudeau's just transition, as he calls it, because when I hear the words just transition, it signals eliminating jobs. And for Alberta, that is a non-starter. I think we all share the same goals when it comes to reducing emissions, and that's across all industries, including oil and natural gas. We are working with the federal government closely on technologies like carbon capture, utilization and storage, hydrogen, critical minerals, but the good work gets lost when they use this kind of divisive, polarizing language. Because the world is looking for energy, for more petrochemicals, for more LNG. This is not an industry in decline, but it is one of the industries that is strategic to world energy security. And Alberta is one of the most responsible producers of energy in the world and has been for decades. We will continue to advocate on behalf of the hundreds of thousands of workers whose livelihoods depend on this industry. And we expect the federal government to stand up for our world-leading oil and natural gas workers instead of trying to eliminate their jobs. So thank you. That's just what I'd like to say by way of opening, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Okay, we'll start with questions.
Do you mind if I just see if there's some water here?
One question, one follow-up. Like always, we'll hit the room and then we'll hit the phones.
Thank you.
We'll start with you, Rick, because you asked. If she can hear you from there, go ahead.
Okay, I'll ask a question.
First? Bell's never first.
I'm stuck in there. I didn't really realize. I'm not smart enough to realize that's what I did. But anyway, yeah, let's go back to the just transition. You have said very clearly, very strongly, unequivocally, that you want to defend the oil patch, oil and gas industry. You have said time and again, including yesterday in a statement, that Trudeau, quote, really wants to shut down the industry and eliminate the workers' jobs, and we're just not going to allow him to do this. We've heard other premiers say that in the past, for the last few decades. So, number one, do you believe that that is his real intention? Do you believe the intention of the Prime Minister and his government is to phase out, get rid of the oils? Like, how big a threat do you perceive the Just Transition Plan and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government and the Green Jesus of Montreal and all the rest of them? How big a threat do you actually see that in reality?
I think it's a big threat. And the reason for that is the language that they're using. Just transition is the language that they used when they phased out the coal industry. It is a social justice term. If they wanted to talk about sustainable jobs, that's completely different. And we'd be quite happy to talk to them about sustainable jobs in carbon tech, sustainable jobs in hydrogen, sustainable jobs in this new economy that we're developing around small modular nuclear and other types of projects. I think we're all on board with that. But to use that terminology, they're virtue signaling to an extreme base that is openly advocating to shut down oil and natural gas. Because look at what happened at a COP27. The final communique talked about ultimately shutting down the oil and natural gas industry in the same way that coal had been phased out. We have a Prime Minister who, when he ran in the last election, talked about that the need to phase out oil sands eventually. He looked at it as inevitability. We don't look at it that way at all. We think that the world is going to need more natural gas. We believe that with carbon capture technology, it's going to make it more and more sustainable. Hydrogen, at its base, the best way to make it is out of methane, which is natural gas. When you look at our oil sands producers, they have an aggressive strategy to reduce emissions and use more bitumen beyond combustion. There's a petrochemical industry that we've been supporting here. So we're just shifting the paradigm. This is not about phasing out any of these jobs. It's about growing them and expanding the opportunity for oil and natural gas workers. And that's the kind of language I would like to hear the Prime Minister use, because we I think, missed an opportunity when the German Chancellor was here, saying that there wasn't a business case for LNG. The Japanese Prime Minister is coming this week begging us to do more development so that we can export LNG. And I would like, for a change, for the Prime Minister to say, yes, we can. and to work with us on making that happen. And this kind of targeted attack on our industry, it doesn't lend itself to cooperative federalism. That's what I'm worried about, and I do take him seriously because of the past statements that he's made on this.
Now, as a supplementary, let us just say for the moment that your fears are in large part realized, and he does proceed aggressively, because we don't know what the just transition plan is yet. But let's say it is a very aggressive plan. What is it that, and a lot of, I think, Albertans would like to know, what is it that you are willing to do? Like when you say, we're just not going to allow him to do this. Does this mean, you know, readers have asked me this morning, does that mean the Sovereignty Act? Does that mean, like, what does that exactly mean? It's one thing to say that you don't like what Trudeau's doing. It's also the right, you also say you'll stand up. But what happens if he actually does pursue an aggressive agenda? What are you concretely prepared to do in response?
Again, I have to see what it is that he has planned, but I'll give you a for instance, this announcement that somehow within 2 years we're going to have 20% of all new vehicles in Alberta be electric vehicles. So I mean, I'm wondering why he isn't asked how are we going to do that. I know, for instance, because I drove a hybrid car over the summer, there's a 5-year waiting list for hybrid vehicles with Toyota, and an equally long waiting list for other electric vehicles. How do you then mandate that 20% of all vehicles sold in Alberta are going to be electric when they aren't even going to be available? I just spoke yesterday with a developer who's installing, who needs to install transformers. We used to be able to get them within days. There's an 80-week delay to install a transformer. You need to do that to be able to enable more houses to be able to have plug-in vehicles. We've got a 2-year wait to be able to even upgrade our power grid. So at some point we have to have an honest conversation about what's doable and what's possible, because here is the issue. If the federal government is pursuing emissions caps and targets that are too aggressive and too short a time frame and unachievable, it is a de facto production cap, which means it's a violation of our constitutional right to choose to develop our own resources. So those are the conversations we're having publicly right now, making them aware that the things that they're announcing are not achievable in the time frame they want to announce it. But if we're working towards the same goal of emissions reduction, and we have a reasonable time frame, and we're working towards having the same kind of technological advancement, then I think we can work collaboratively and cooperatively. So I'm going to try to do that approach first. My read of how the Supreme Court operates is that if we both agree that there's a problem, Alberta does not act in its area of jurisdiction, then the courts will defer to Ottawa to act in our areas of jurisdiction. It's why we have a carbon tax, and it's why they took over plastics. So we are going to make sure that we put forward a robust plan to reduce emissions in a way that works for Alberta. And then we'll be prepared to, if we have to have them take us to court to fight it out, because we are not phasing this industry out. We don't have to. We can export LNG, which will reduce global emissions. We can use carbon technology to capture CO2 embedded into useful products or buried underground. We can develop a hydrogen industry. We can develop a small modular nuclear industry. And those are all of the things that get us to the same goal. So I believe that if it came down to a court fight, that we'd win it.
Let me correct you there for a second. It's by 2026, in 3 years. This 20% zero emissions vehicle mandate, not 2 years.
Okay, I thought he said 2025.
But I wanted you to finish your thought there. How, because your office had talked about using the Sovereignty Act to blunt the effect or somehow combat the zero emissions vehicle. How would that work? I think what I'm interested in looking at is how might we be able to bring more zero emissions vehicles on in our market. Our market, it actually makes more sense for us to be pursuing hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And I quite frankly don't think that the federal government is doing enough to be able to attract that kind of development here. So that's the kind of thing I'd like to see, is are we able to attract Toyota or Honda or Hyundai to come here and develop hydrogen fuel cell vehicles? Are we able to do more work with our transportation industry to do dual use engines as they are right now and converting them to hydrogen and biodiesel? Is there some way that we can use additives or new products to be able to reduce overall emissions? I've seen a number of technological advancements along those lines. So there are different ways to be able to achieve a reduced emissions outcome, and that's what we'll be putting on the table. Sorry, once again, that doesn't explain how the Sovereignty Act would work. There's nothing.
As I said, we haven't made a decision to invoke the Sovereignty Act on anything.
Talk about it being a symbolic gesture, putting a shield around Alberta. At what point does it stop becoming, it's implemented, we're signaling something, and when does it become action? If you aren't happy with how the new year started, if you aren't happy with a litany of things that you have discussed at length, when does it shift? What would that take?
It depends on how far the Prime Minister is prepared to go in pushing this. I know that there are ministers in his government that we can work with that understand our position, and we're working closely with them to try to make sure that we can achieve our common goals. So I'm just going to keep on working on in that vein until we see what kind of legislation comes forward. They're not back, I don't believe, until January the 30th. So I want to see what the legislation looks like and what kind of impact it's going to have. But they need to stop this language. They need to stop using the social justice language of just transition, because we all know what that means. It means phasing out oil and natural gas workers, and that is not on. If they want to talk to us about how we'll invest in hydrogen, how we can collaboratively invest in carbon capture and technology, I'm all open to having that discussion, as I told the Prime Minister the first time that I spoke with him. But I would just like to see that they're recognizing that we are a leader in this area. We're a leader on hydrogen production. We're a leader on carbon technology, as opposed to acting like somehow we're late to the party on this. We're not. We've been doing this kind of work for decades in hydrogen, and since 2007 on carbon technology. So I think that there's a little bit of politicking happening at the federal level. Maybe there's a federal election coming, but it's not helpful when we're trying to find some joint and common solutions around these issues.
If the federal government may be playing politics because there's a federal election coming on some of the federal provincial issues, you stand before us here as a politician with a provincial election coming. Are you telling us that there's no politics or electoral calculus in behind the Sovereignty Act and your approach to federal politics?
I can tell you what I've observed, because I've observed the federal government for a long time. And what I do know is that when we had an equalization referendum to say we wanted to start a change in our relationship with the federal government, within days, Justin Trudeau appointed Stephen Guilbeault. Stephen Guilbeault has since denounced that he wanted to have an emissions cap on fertilizer, emissions cap on oil and natural gas, that he wants to have a mandatory carbon capture on our power grid, that he wants to have mandatory purchase of combustion engine vehicles, that we're bringing through clean fuel standards, that he wants to increase the amount of biodiversity coverage in our province. That seems to me to be provocative. They've taken over plastics. They wouldn't allow us to back out of the carbon tax. How many hits can Alberta take before we say stop it, put up a shield, and start pushing back? So I would say that everything that I have done to this point has been in response to what I have seen as a hostile federal government invading our jurisdiction. And I think Albertans expect me to stand up for Albertans. That's what I'm going to do.
All right, let's hit the phone line.